If you're going to install a circuit, then you will normally be working from drawings. In reality though, if you're out in the workplace, and particularly if you're taking an old installation out, you'll basically be designing it as you go. But the bottom line is, all circuits have to be designed, firstly, to be watertight, and secondly, to only go horizontally and vertically. And that's not me saying that, that's the water regulations that require us to only run pipework and cables horizontally and vertically. And that's to prevent them from being damaged if they're concealed in walls or floors by people drilling into them, carrying out other operations. You really need, when you are fabricating, and again on site it's not that difficult to achieve, you can carry a board like this around in your van. You can actually mark it out on floors like this with builder's chalk. Obviously if it's a customer's floor, don't be using Sharpies and things because it'll be very difficult to get it up afterwards. But a pencil actually is your go-to tool for marking out, because it can be rubbed out afterwards. So that's why I prefer you using pencils to Sharpies, but Sharpies make it easier for you to see when you're practicing. So we've got a jig, and I've already set out the 4 bends that I'm going to try and achieve: a 15mm 90 degree, a 22mm 90 degree, a 15mm 135 degree parallel offset, and a 30mm saddle. When you do a saddle, the idea is that you pass over the pipe with 1 pipe diameter distance above it. So and that's to allow for insulation as well, if the pipe has to be insulated at a later date. Okay, so the first one we're going to do is the 15 degree 90 bend. And as I said to you when you were practicing this, you need to have a template to work from, whether it's drawn on a floor, drawn on a board, or directly drawn on where you're going to install it, on a wall. If you don't have that, you're likely to make mistakes in the bend. Well, to do a 90 degree bend in 15mm copper tube, first of all, you need to know what length of pipe you need, and so that's where you go to your drawing first for your dimensions. And you need its length and you need its return bend, and so on this particular drawing it's 400mm in its length, and it's 400mm overall on the frame, and it's 250mm to the center of that T. So we need to take that 250 from 400, which will give us an extra 150 to add to our 400, 550mm. You don't need more pipe than that when you're bending with copper tube, because it will grow in the bending machine. In a bending machine, we use one of these for copper. You've got your former, which is the curved part which forms the bend. You've got a pulling arm, which you're going to pull a guide, and it must be the correct size guide. And some of you, even I think it was in the other group, did make a mistake selecting the wrong size guides. You'll damage the guide, and you'll also damage your pipe if you select the wrong size guide. And also the guides match the machine. So this particular machine, that's its correct guide for this machine. We have other bending machines which have a different colour guide. So you must make sure you get the correct diameter and using the correct guide that came with the machine. So the roller on our pulling arm rolls around the back of the guide, which pulls the pipe around the former to form the bend. As it does so, it's basically extruding the pipe, which is basically growing the pipe. And that's why we don't need any additional measurement to sort of a margin of error, because we'll always have enough pipe to do the bend, and in fact we'll end up having to cut a little bit off because it grows by about 4 times the radius, so it's quite substantial growth on 15mm. Well, to do a 90 bend then, we need to go to our template. The key to getting it correct is to have a stop. So we've got a 400mm length, and we want that to be accurately 400mm, and we have a return of 150mm. And so I haven't actually cut this exactly to 450, but we can do. So get a tape measure, and we will now, as you know, you can cut copper tube with a pipe slice, which has to be the correct size for the diameter you're working with, or a pipe cutter, which is adjustable, and a pipe cutter will allow you to cut from 8mm to 35mm. I strongly suggest that when you purchase your toolkit, these are very useful, particularly in confined areas where you're trying to cut into a pipe, so you will need a slice, but you also need one of these. This can go anywhere with you, and you can cut any diameter of pipe. So I'm going to use the cutter instead of the slice, and I'm going to just make sure that it's on my mark exactly where I want it, so the cutting wheel, and the test is that it's just enough pressure so that the cutter does not fall off the pipe. If it was any looser and it went like that, it's not quite ready to use, so get it right on your mark. With a cutter, let the wheel do the job. So as it goes around once, you're just turning it a couple of millimeters, that's all. And all you're basically doing is keeping the tension on the wheel, and so it becomes one fluid movement. Every time you go around, you see I'm just giving it a tighten by a millimeter or so, and you just need to be patient, and that will cut nicely through the pipe. And there's our copper pipe cut. When you want to bend a 15mm pipe, you need to start from a fixed end, and the fixed end in this case is going to be on the center line. Remember, these are center line bends. It's going to be on the center line of that pipe that's connected to that elbow at the top. So our elbow, if we had a 15mm elbow, it would be going on there. So we're going to, it would be going on there. That's our return. So we're going to put it on our stop mark, and that's the key. Start from your stop mark, and then mark on the board exactly where you want the center to end up. Now we'll have to use a longer piece actually, because this we'll struggle with, so I'll use this one. So exactly where you want it to end up. Where some of you have been making the mistakes with your bends is we then have to measure back. And when I say measure back, you measure back to where you started. So if you start here, you're measuring back this way. Because even though that's where we want the center of the bend to be, because it's going to grow in the bending machine, that center line is going to move. And if we don't account for that movement in center line, we're going to end up with one leg shorter than the other. So in order to do that, we've got to work it out mathematically. And we use a thing called McKeown's table, which is the simplest method. There are other methods you can use, but McKeown's table is the simplest. And it basically, for a series of bends, and we predominantly use 90 degree, 60 degree, 45 and 30 degree bends, then we can go straight to McKeown's table, and based on the diameter of the pipe, we can select how far back we need to measure to allow for the radius on the former. So for 15mm tube, for a 90 degree bend, which we're going to form, we need to measure back 70mm. If you measure forward, if you go that way, which some of you did on your 22 and some of you did on your offset, that's why you end up with a wider offset or a bend that is shorter on one leg. So we're measuring back this way, 70mm. So we need to get our mark, and we need to accurately mark back. And when you're marking back, don't use a tape measure, because you always lose a couple of millimeters because the stop has to be flexible. Use a steel rule. Steel rules are much more accurate, and for when you're getting down to millimeters, you need to be working with a steel rule and not a tape measure. Okay, once you've got your back mark, so that you don't get mixed up with it, roll the pipe around so that that mark is all the way around the pipe. and then put a little arrow on it indicating it's the back mark. So we've got our center line and we've got our back mark. And I know when I put that in the machine now where my back mark is going to go, because that's the important one for the accuracy of the bend. So I'm going to take it to the bending machine now. You have to be aware when you're working with a scissor bending machine, if you're working in a vise like we are today, when the pulling arm is out, that's a health and safety hazard, because if you're working in a confined area or a walkway, people don't realize an obstacle's being put in their way and they can walk into the bending arm. So when you're not using it, make sure it's in the closed position. So we're going to put it into our bending machine using the top former, and we're going to bend it so that our back mark lines up with the back of the former. And that will hopefully bring our center mark to the center of the former when we form the bend. So you need to always feed your pipe in from the back, that way you don't make a mistake. And that's where our line needs to be, and I'm just going to get the guide, slip the guide in, and make sure you get the clamp on. And then just put a tiny little bit of tension on so it doesn't move, and just adjust the pipe so that that back mark is very accurately lined up. Every millimetre of inaccuracy at the back end is 4 times on the bend, and so you grow that inaccuracy, and that's why you need to be very accurate with your marks. So we're now ready to bend. Just put a little bit of tension on so that it doesn't move, and then we can start and slowly just roll the guide around the back of the former. And we want 90 degrees. Well, I'm going to take it so far. There's 2 ways we can achieve 90 degrees. We can actually put a 90-degree mark on our former, which is what you will do with your own machines, or we can check it with a set square. This is an angle finder. Angle finders, as I said to you, are a precision instrument, and they're an expensive instrument. An angle finder like this will be 60 or 70 pounds, so they're not a cheap. And you don't want that rolling around in the back of your van getting damaged. So that lives in with your precision instruments where it's not going to get damaged. And we've set it to, in our little window, to 90 degrees. Then we're going to get a homemade, so that's our angle finder. We're going to get a homemade angle set. So we can set that angle, we can transfer it to our angle set around the back of the angle finder. And then we're just going to just tighten it up. And that can be carried around with us as our 90-degree set. If you don't use an angle finder in a set, you're going to have inaccuracy in your bends. So we then need to take this to the bending machine. We're nearly there. And remember, it's a center line measurement. So I'm placing this on top of the former, over the top of the pipe, and I'm lining it up with my center line. And it's at this point that you can put a mark on your former using your set to give you a guide as where your 90 degrees needs to be. Because it's a bit difficult trying to hold a 90-degree set and bend at the same time. So I'm now going to continue bending round to that mark. And it's just coming round now. And there's always a bit of spring when you're bending, so it'll always spring back a bit. So just allow for the spring, get one more nudge. And that's just about on center line. Don't overbend, so just take it out of the clamp, and take it out and just check it. And you can see it's a little bit underbent. It's not quite 90 degrees yet. But that's better to be underbent than overbent. So I'm just going to pop it back in. And this time when you put it back in, make sure that the pipe goes right back into the former. If you don't, it will try and double bend it and you will get a ripple on your pipe. So put your guide back in to where you were. And we're just a little bit underbent. And I can see from my marks we are, so I'm just going to bring it round. and to about there. And that should be now our 90-degree bend. So that should be our 90-degree bend, and we'll just stick it onto our angle set, if I can hold it. And you can see it is a 90-degree bend, okay? And it should be on our stop on center line. So we've got a center line here and a center line here. Let's mark it onto the stop there. And so that's a nice, accurate 90-degree, 15mm bend.